Good afternoon. In researching how soldiers coped with adversity during the Civil War, I came across two books that caught my attention from the Oxford Scholarship Online database. The first book, edited by Peter Brock, is Liberty and Conscience, a documentary history of conscientious objectors in America through the Civil War. Brock's 2002 volume covers the earlier period of conscription, which ran from the colonial era to the conclusion of the Civil War. Since I have a special interest in the Civil War, I chose to focus on Brock's chapter on Civil War America. Brock relies heavily on letters, diaries, memoirs, court documents, early autobiographies, 19th century journals and books, and witness accounts. Of note, Brock includes 13 primary source documents in his chapter on Civil War America that illustrate the experiences of conscientious objectors. Brock argues in his book that Civil War America presented pacifists, especially in the North, with an agonizing dilemma, for many of them had been in the forefront of the anti-slavery movement. How could they refrain from support of the Unionist war effort without betraying their anti-slavery past? On the other hand, how could they participate in war without abandoning their pacifist principles and beliefs in nonviolence? In addressing these questions, Brock examines how Shakers, Quakers, Brethren, Mennonites, Adventists, and Christadelphians responded to the dilemma confronting them. Brock further looks at how peace sects in the Confederate States who opposed slavery and secession struggled with authorities. Once conscripted into the Army, pacifists in both the North and South had a few choices they could make according to Brock. First, a pacifist could agree to take up arms. Second, a pacifist could procure a substitute. Third, one could pay a commutation fee in lieu of serving. Fourth, a pacifist could flee. Fifth, later in the war, one could choose hospital work. And finally, a pacifist could object to serve and pay the punishment. Brock discusses how responses varied among pacifists, but many remained true to their conscience. Brock points out how the punishment varied in severity based on the circumstances and persons involved. Generally speaking, the cost for conscientious objection was far more severe in the South than the North. The second book that I selected stands in contrast to Brock's work by looking at those individuals who were often eager to fight. In her book, Unlawful Combatants, A Genealogy of the Irregular Fighter, Sabala Shipers discusses irregular fighters from the mid-1700s into the 21st century. As I examined Shipers' 2015 book, I focused my attention on irregular fighters during the Civil War. Shipers draws mainly from the works of other historians, including James McPherson, Robert Mackey, Daniel Sutherland, Richard Brownlee, and Mark Grimsley, as well as the work of Francis Lieber. According to Shipers, the involvement of irregular fighters in the American Civil War was considerable. Irregulars numbered presumably in the tens of thousands, which is rather a small number compared to the number of Union Confederate soldiers. However, Shipers argues that guerrillas, as she calls them, had a decisive impact on the war. Their existence and activities did not affect so much the outcome of the war, but rather the operations, tactics, policies, and public narratives of the war. The role of irregulars was slightly more important on the Confederate side for various and partly interrelated reasons. First, occupation by Union forces often fostered irregular activities. Second, irregulars thrived in a Southern and Western cultural context that included a strong vigilante and ranger tradition. Third, the Confederate government maintained a highly ambivalent stance towards irregular fighters throughout the war. Shipers further points out how irregular fighters were most active in the border states, where there was a split between Union and Confederacy supporters, mainly Missouri, Kansas, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Most significantly, Shipers discusses how contemporaries of the American Civil War had considerable difficulties in visibly distinguishing between regular and irregular forces. Furthermore, there also existed a number of different irregular fighters. In 1862, General Halleck commissioned Francis Lieber to write a legal memorandum on the problem of guerrilla warfare. Lieber distinguished 6 different types of irregular fighters: freebooter, brigand, partisan, spy, war rebel, and armed peasant. Of these 6 types of irregulars, only the partisans and armed peasants were lawful belligerents in Lieber's eyes. In the end, the Union government and its military leaders did not follow Lieber's opinion on the treatment of irregular fighters. The prevailing opinion was that all irregular fighters were unlawful belligerents and deserved death. Thank you very much.